Welcome to the CASC podcast, a show where we connect you with the science and people behind climate adaptation. I'm your host, Michelle Jewell, and I'm joined in the studio today by the one and only Kristen Fontana. Good morning, Kristen. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Up to anything interesting this weekend, Kristen?
I have a couple of Halloween parties today and tomorrow.
Today and tomorrow.
They both start at 9, which is really late. But tonight, I'm going to be the dragon from Shrek.
No.
It's a Shrek-themed party. I had no other option.
And what's tomorrow? Are you repeating, or do you have to do...
I don't think I'm repeating just because I don't think my boyfriend wants to be Donkey again. I think he's probably going to wear like an outfit he wore for Comic-Con, and I have like a Batwoman thing I put together. So.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Yes.
I'm excited. Hopefully you're going to bring pictures. Today, we are so excited to have the pleasure of chatting with conservation biologist, rare plant aficionado, Alex Loomis. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
What are you dressing up for Halloween?
I have no Halloween plans, and I am going to a wedding this weekend that is explicitly no costumes allowed. Yes, I luckily do not have to think of what to dress as.
We're so happy to have you on the show. One of the first questions to get out of the way is you're currently an ORISE postdoctoral scholar?
Fellow? Yeah, program participant, whatever you want to call it.
Great.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So ORISE is a program that is basically a way to hire people to work for federal agencies without actually being federal employees. You're hired in as a participant so that you can work on a postdoc project or some sort of short to medium term project for a federal agency, or they hire people for other types of groups as well.
What does it mean to be a postdoctoral status?
Generally, postdoc projects are succinct, single, one-off projects, and there's faculty or scientists out there that think we want to hire someone with expertise that can come in and do this one chunk project, rather than developing your original research like you're doing as a PhD student.
So what is the project that you're working on now?
The goal of my project is to look at the climate impacts of rare plants in the Southeast. For my project, actually, the Southeast is defined more broadly than the CASC footprint, right? So it's based on the CAFWA region, which is Southeastern Fish and Wildlife Agencies, from Texas, Oklahoma, north up to Virginia, and then down to Florida. And I should say that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are also part of CAFWA, but unfortunately, we don't have the resources to work on rare plants there yet. I'm working off a list of 1,800 species.
Whoa.
Wow.
1,800. Where do you even start?
The whole goal of this project is to figuring out how to rapidly do this. And the driving motivation of this project is these things called state wildlife action plans, which every state is required to do on a 10-year cycle. Historically, most states have not included plants in those. They're not required to include plants. But last year, the Restoring America's Wildlife Act was floating around in Congress, and RAWA would have tied large amounts of financial incentive to states including plants in those plans for the first time. Now, RAWA did not pass, but all the states have already decided to include plants in these plans anyway, which is great. That bill is still being reintroduced, and there's a possibility that will be back in the future.
Just a quick acronym note. RAWA.
RAWA, Restoring America's Wildlife Act.
And then you didn't say the acronym, but SWAPs, right?
SWAPs, yes. State Wildlife Action Plans are, SWAPs.
These are ones that you'll hear throughout the length of this podcast and future podcasts, I'm sure.
Very acronym heavy here.
Mm-hmm. So tell us some of your favorites, dare I say, that are on that list of 1,800, or the ones that you're spending the most time on right now?
So one thing that I'm doing is going through species by species and asking, is there any study that addresses climate? Because in general, plants are understudied. And when you have a list that long, they're really understudied. I should mention the list is categorized into level of conservation concern. And so there's moderate, high, and very high. I've now gotten to the point where I can say that of the high and very high, which is about half of the species, only 2.7% have a study that there's some sort of statistical model that is saying this is how this species might respond to climate in terms of its distribution or abundance. It's a very low number. That's not to say that we need to have a study for everyone to know what to do, but it's certainly worthwhile to illustrate that lack of statistical models showing where these things might go in future climate. Around 2.5% had some sort of model. About 8%, there's some paper that addresses climate change and that species, and 16% have any sort of conservation-related paper at all. So the vast majority of this list is just unstudied in terms of climate change. Doesn't mean we don't know what to do. And in fact, many of the states have ongoing conservation actions that address all of them. But there's kind of a dearth of scientific information that informs that. Even the species that we do know things about that are so famous, the information is not that great. And actually, Venus flytraps, there's tons of papers out there. But in fact, until like last year, there was no actual model that looked at projecting what they're going to do under future climate. That's pretty shocking, even for those really charismatic, cool species. There's not very much out there.
A lot of people don't know that's an endemic species to the Carolinas. It's a really rare plant, maybe, which is also a question mark around it. But the only ones that exist are somewhere here in the Carolinas.
Yeah, so it is on the list. And the distribution of Venus flytraps is fascinating and not really well explained in the scientific literature. We don't know why it doesn't go further south into Georgia, in Florida. And there's introduced populations in Florida that grow just fine. So it's an oddity that it's pretty restricted to the Carolina coastal plain.
And I imagine when it comes to rare plants in particular, I'm assuming that they're not widespread. So having that super local pinpoint of prediction is probably pretty important
for sure. That's the thing that we always ask with rare plants that have a restricted range is, were they always just locally rare and they're a very local endemic species that was never widespread, or were they once widespread and they're living in these sort of remnant populations? And the other thing we don't know, is it climate that's determining why there's only one plant there? Because often there's not. We know that there's all sorts of other interactions, biotic interactions, pollinators, dispersal, all sorts of different things that could be the reason that a plant is only in one place. If there's only one spot, we can't just say what areas are going to meet these climate conditions where it is now in the future, because we don't know about all those other things that are out there. So in some cases, it might not be worth having some sort of projection model, and we might be better off as climate scientists or climate interested ecologists spending our time looking at maybe more common species that determine those ecosystems and what their effects are going to be. For example, there's all these rare plants that love longleaf pine savanna. So we should ask the question of where are the longleaf pines likely to survive in the future? And we can see this is its current distribution and how that might change. So when you're working with really rare species, you start thinking creatively about how you can get information from more common species that can actually drive statistically robust science.
Right. Just for a point of clarity, with those longleaf pines, you're assuming that then becomes an ecosystem where these rare plants could potentially also do well. Like, you're trying to figure out where those
and we don't know for sure, right? If we have longleaf pine in further northern area, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but just for example, if you have that, we don't know for sure that the rare plant is going to still be able to live there, but we have a better guess that might be appropriate habitat than someplace else that doesn't have that sort of plant community. We've had Alan Weekly at UNC, who's a godfather of the southeastern flora, assigning each plant to those ecosystems, and we're going with that as our best guess of what is the ecosystem that each plant needs to survive.
Right.
I was just going to ask, like, how you got interested in native plants. I know you grew up in Hawaii, so if you can go into that, that's really exciting.
Yeah, for sure. My background has been almost exclusively with rare plants in Hawaii. So I grew up in Hawaii. I really got into learning the flora when I was early in high school. When I started driving, I started going on all these hikes around the mountains. And of course, Hawaii has beautiful mountains and really interesting ecosystems and really diverse flora. I just got interested and felt compelled to learn these things. And part of that was like, this is my backyard. This is the place I feel like I should be engaging with and taking care of, and I should learn about it when I can. Ultimately, after high school, I ended up going to college on the mainland in Colorado, but I would return in the summers, and I started working for the Army's Natural Resource Program there as a contractor. We were working with a pretty long list of about 80 species that are impacted by training, doing field work, managing them, learning all the ins and outs of management, from rare plant-specific things like reintroductions of plants to augment populations. We were hand pollinating things, but we were also controlling threats. So we were doing weed control of invasive species. We were doing rat control to keep down rat populations and all sorts of other sort of activities. We were building fences to keep pigs out of there. So I got really deep into all of the different actions that it takes to manage rare species. When I decided I wanted to go to grad school, I was very determined to still study Hawaiian plants in my dissertation work. But I was not determined to stay in Hawaii to do that necessarily. So I contacted faculty with the idea of, I want to work in Hawaii. Are you open to that? And I ended up here in North Carolina at Duke in a lab where sort of everybody uses the same statistical tools, but we go off all over the world to work in the plant systems that we care about. I was there for 6 years studying the interactions between native populations and alien non-native plants, as well as climate, and looking at how those things are likely to drive future population growth.
When you were on the mainland, did you ever think that you would stay, or you always knew you wanted to go
I've
Hawaii?
always wanted to be back. I loved my time exploring, and as soon as I got to the mainland, I was like, I'm going everywhere. So I've been to all 50 states. I've been trying to go to the highest point of every state, of which I've done like 44, I think. So I've been exploring wildly, but I think that's because I grew up in Hawaii, and I was like, and I know I want to be in Hawaii. I'm like, while I'm here, I have to see everything. Coming into this project, I'm glad that I had time living in the Southeast. I haven't seen every ecosystem, but at least have been through large swaths of these areas. So when I look at a plant, I look at a species, and I can be like, oh, I think I've gone hiking in that national forest. I think that's really helpful when you're doing a project where you're working for the wide geographic footprint, to at least have some connections to the places that you're working.
You have now mentioned things like hand pollinating plants. You've talked about rat control. You've talked about building fences. I'm hearing a lot of field stories.
Oh, yeah.
What is your favorite moment in the field that sticks out to you that you want to tell us the story?
Oh, man, I've had so many good field experiences. In Hawaii, we call it a shirt off to double shaka moment, because you're so excited that you take your shirt off and you throw 2 shakas up like this when you find the plant. So there's been a few of those. There's a tree species that I really love. It's the largest Hawaiian tree, and there's 30 of them known, and I found the 32nd, I think. And so that was another moment
cool.
where it's crazy because they're being killed by an insect pest. They look like driftwood skeletons, like 100 feet tall, and then they'll have one little shoot. So I saw it, and you get excited, but you have to look for the little green part before you know it's actually alive. When I was working for the Army, we were helicoptering into the mountains almost every week and camping in these really remote areas. And there was a day that we almost lost our intern in a flash flood.
Wow.
So we were surveying a river. The intern from the greenhouse, so he hadn't even been doing field work for the whole summer, but we had him out there, and we knew the weather was a little bit unstable. We didn't think it was that bad, and so we were actually walking through this stream, and of course when the rain hit, we were in a part of the stream where you couldn't get out. So we were just hiking up, starting at knee deep and then waist deep, and there was one last stream crossing that we had to rig up a rope over. But the best part of this is we crossed the stream, we started hiking up to the cabin that we had that was at the top, and we were so happy. And just as we were hiking to the cabin, all of our phones started buzzing. Flash flood warning. Like, we could have used this 2 hours ago before we almost were washed down the river. So
Oh my God.
that was a particularly harrowing moment. But and I don't think we found anything good on that survey, sadly. But
I thought you were going to say, I don't think we ended up finding the intern. I was like, oh no.
That's just a shirt off moment.
Yeah.
No shakas involved.
no double shot.
You said that one of those spark moments in your career was going hiking with the botanists.
Yeah.
Can you tell us that story?
I was going off and doing these things that were making my mom nervous, and I still kept doing that, but I started meeting these botanists who knew everything about these places. I have one guy in particular who's this absolutely genius guy. His friend hiked with us. He always said, the more you know, the more you see. And that was something that I really took to heart. When I was working for the Army, we were doing all this rappelling work where we were doing rope access down these huge cliffs to get to rare plants, collect cuttings so we could bring them back to our greenhouse and put them out. But in the process of looking for one of these Army target species, I found a species that I didn't know. But as soon as I saw it, I knew it was native and I knew it was something special. But the only way I could know that is from knowing all that other information where you know enough to know it's not any of these things I know. It turned out it was something that hadn't been found on Oahu since 1835 or 1840. It's a woody violet that's on this 700-foot tall cliff. And since we've gone back and actually found the full population of about 60 of them, and they're outplanting them now, which is really exciting to see.
That's incredible.
So that was like the culmination of like, the more you know, the more you see. And that's what ecology is about, is seeing all the things that you might not have noticed otherwise.
Yeah, I had a professor say the same thing to me when I was in forest ecology. And every time I was walking, I was like, I know what that is. I know what that is. And that was the first semester where I changed my major from engineering to natural resources.
There's so many different things happening in ecosystems that if it might not be the plants, it might be the soils, it might be, maybe it's lichens. And anybody can come up with a part that they like and they learn about. And there's so much to learn there and see there, even if they're not seeing the same things that I'm seeing. And that's why We need people studying all sorts of parts of the system because there's just the depth there is really amazing.
Everything is connected. and the quicker you can work your way through the Dunning-Kruger curve where you think you know everything, and then the more you learn, you realize you know absolutely nothing. And then eventually you start to get to the other side of that where
Absolutely.
you can start to discover really rare violets.
Yeah.
If you could explain a little bit of what like your day-to-day is in your postdoc, because obviously if you're in Hawaii, you're not doing fieldwork in the Southeast.
That's
so
true.
What it looks like you're researching and looking at literature. Or
Yeah, so I'm not really generating any new models of my own, which makes me a little bit sad. But I'm learning a lot about a lot of things, right? It's one of these depth versus breadth of knowledge things. And I have two sort of angles. One is these species by species literature reviews where I'm just scraping the literature to see what there is. Convincing Google Scholar that I'm a robot and getting locked out for 3 days at a time.
Oh my gosh.
That's happened twice already. Because
my
partially because there's so
gosh,
many
that's
species
so
that have no studies. And so you search a species and it's got 0 results right away. You search another one, you search another one. So when you get a lot of no hits in a row, it thinks that you're like a robot that's scraping it. And which first it starts making you do reCAPTCHAs.
Yes.
And then after you do those successfully about 6 or 7 times, it says you're locked out. And it's the first time it was a day and I could switch browsers. The second time it was actually 3 days. And I was like using a VPN to see if I could do it.
No way.
And then finally, it was quite something. That's the species by species level. The other angle is the ecosystem level, right? So I'm picking the ecosystems that have the most species on my list. And I'm trying to put together a package of science that can be used. That involves some GIS work. I'm making the map of that ecosystem with spatial data that I'm getting from NatureServe, who's a partner on the project. I'm extracting climate data for points within that sort of represent the variation in climate projections. And then I'm doing literature review that's saying for a Florida xeric scrub or longleaf pine, these are what we are likely to see in terms of ecological impacts. And then presenting these are the list of plants that are there, and then saying these are some potential management actions that consider climate. So my day-to-day is sitting there pulling out literature from different places, kind of compile these things, yes. Put together packages of information that address, okay, these are the things we know, and this is how we might plan for that uncertainty, right? So we know that it's going to be hotter. Under almost every scenario, all of these places are going to be hotter. So it may or may not be wetter or drier. There might be more droughts. But if there are droughts, we do know that it's going to be worse because the temperature is higher. These managers want the answers. They want to know what to do now. But sometimes you have to tell them, we don't know. And so the best that we can do is try to plan for uncertainty. And I think that's what a lot of climate adaptation science is, communicating uncertainty and communicating what we do know and how to plan with those two things in mind.
Yeah. Do you have examples of either this work or previous work that you've done that has been used on the ground and how that's looked?
Yeah, so actually one of my dissertation chapters was on a rare plant that I generated what is now the largest in situ population of for my research, with the thought that even if this experiment fails, I'll be handing over to the state rare plant program or the plant extinction prevention program a few hundred plants planted out of a species that there's only 8 wild plants of. So that was really cool. And in fact, I think half of that experiment did fail and result in almost nothing. But the other half is actually pretty interesting and is also informing the way that they're doing weed control there now, which is doing less weed control and being very judicious about how many invasive species they actually remove from the area, because taking out too much too fast can actually have some pretty negative effects on the native plant. For what I'm working on now, it's going to take a long time to see if it's actually used, because it has to get through a lot of layers, right? First, the state has to decide they care about this, they want to include it in their wildlife action plan. Then the state wildlife action plan has to actually drive action. So hopefully, even if it's not somebody's taking this plan and walking out into the field with it, it does trickle down into the agencies and into the people that are actually managing the species. The sooner we can get more climate information into their hands, the better, right?
So the swap is due to be published X date, and you are trying to get in there.
Most states are publishing them in 2025. There's a couple oddballs that are on their own schedule. They have to be incorporating this information in 2024, hence the rapid approach. I would love to mine every inch of data and build sort of projection models for things for individual species. But like I said, 1,800 species, it's a daunting list. And so it's do what we can now so that at least some of this gets into this most immediate upcoming wildlife action plan cycle.
My closing question for you is, Why do we need rare plants? Why put in this effort?
It's a good question. And I should define the terms here, right? This rare plants, there's about 1,800 on the list. That still represents about 20% of the biodiversity in the Southeast in terms of number of species. There's many things here that are potentially important parts of ecosystems, whether that's on a functional level, contributing to biogeochemical processes or supporting animal diversity, or there's so many other potential benefits of these rare plants. Once the biodiversity is gone, we can't get it back. With the really rare things, the approach is often, let's save it now and figure out what it does to us later. What we know about the rare plants is not enough to let them go quite yet. Which now I feel a little guilty that I've talked so much about Venus flytraps, which are the most charismatic and well-known things instead of some obscure forb, someplace else. But that's just as cool. But I think rare plants are really important, and we don't want to lose that amount of biodiversity from ecosystems anywhere.
Alex, Loomis, thank you again for joining us on the CASC podcast. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and I hope your weekend is a shirt-off double shaka weekend. The CASC podcast is organized by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and produced with an immense amount of help by the NC State University Libraries team. The USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center's mission is to deliver science that is useful and used to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to the changing climates. Michelle Jewell is the Communications and Engagement Manager for the CASC, and Kristen Fontana is a Climate Science Translation and Communications Fellow with CASC.